Well, hello everyone, and so today what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you an alternative history of the United Kingdom, and it's something I've wanted to share with you for quite a long time, and it really came up on the last retreat that I did back in May. So I'm going to make this all to do with food and the things that people in the UK have consumed. So it's how what we put into our bodies has actually changed us over the last 1,000 years. And if you go back all that time, and I'm aiming this at more like your average people, so this is not about the nobility, it's not about kings and queens, aristocrats, no, this is about normal ordinary people. So if we go back to those times, go back a good 1,000 years, then what people used to consume was so very, very different, and the biggest difference is as follows. We now have a vast variety of foods which we consume, and they come from all over the world. In those days, all the foods that we consumed came from really local, really nearby. And the thing to grasp is that the foods which were more valuable were all grown and produced for the aristocracy, the nobility. So this is what people's diet used to be like. Well, first of all, what they drank, they couldn't drink the water because the water would give them cholera and other horrible diseases. So what they used to do, they used to drink something which was called small beer, and it was also called ale. So they would ferment the water with yeast, and there were no hops. Basically it would be barley, simple grain, and yeast, but no hops at all, and that's what makes it have the name ale, and that's what they drank. Tea and coffee didn't exist at that time, so this literally was all there was. Some people might drink herb teas, that would be a possibility, but the main thing that was drunk was basically ale. Now this ale had a very low alcohol content compared with modern beers, but nonetheless it was alcohol, very, very weak alcohol, and that's what people used to drink. So what we had is we had an entire population that was what I would call low-grade alcoholics. So everyone was slightly alcoholic. And the main thing about alcohol, as we know, is that although in the very short term it's a stimulant, actually over the long time it's a depressant, so it depresses people. So it makes people kind of depressed and down in terms of their energy. Then in terms of the food, what they used to eat meat, and they used to eat something which was called a trencher. And a trencher is something that's made from wheat, and it's a very simple thing. So it's wheat flour, and the flour would have been wholemeal in those days. The white flour was only for the aristocracy, again the rich people, they would eat white bread. But the people, common people, they didn't eat bread, they ate these things called a trencher, which is basically flour mixed with water to make a dough, maybe a little bit of yeast, and it was like a plate. So it was rose and it'd be cooked like a plate, and this plate was what they put the food on. So the trencher would be covered with the meat and the gravy and vegetables. Very, very few vegetables were available because most of the vegetables people eat today in the UK didn't exist. They come from other countries. They had things like turnips, swede, cabbage. That was about it. Yeah. Because almost all the vegetables that English people think is normal for them to eat didn't exist. Things like carrots came from Italy, potatoes, tomatoes, onions. None of these vegetables are native to this country. They all come from other countries. So very, very little. And if you study the Middle Ages, you will discover that the common people used to think that vegetables is something you should eat in small quantities because they're actually bad for you, dodgy to eat. So the main thing would be grains and meat with a little bit of vegetables, but very, very little. Things like garlic, no, that didn't exist in this part of the world at all. Peppers, almost all the vegetables we think of didn't exist. So the diet was very plain and very simple. There's a lot of meat and a lot of grains. Basically that's what it was. So meat, grains and beer. That's pretty much was our diet at that time. So this had a massive effect on the consciousness of the people, and it tended to keep people very limited in terms of their consciousness. They were living in what was called a feudal society. Feudal society is a bit hard to get your head around, but it really is as simple as this. People were serfs, which means they were kind of slaves. And there's a subtle difference, because a slave would get their food provided for, but no, the serf had it harder, because what the serf would do is they would work every day on the Lord's land, growing all the things that the Lord needed to support him and his family and all his retainers, which was hangers-on. This is literally how it used to be. And their free time was used, first of all, they would have to go to church, that was mandatory, and the rest of the time they would be growing their own food. And they had what we called a strip system. So the majority of the land belonged to the Lord, and the Lord would give little strips of land for the serfs to be able to grow their own food on, and that's what they did in their free time. So they had a really hard life, in a way much harder than the life of a slave, because a slave would have things provided for them. No, they had to provide everything for themselves. Hard to imagine how things were. And then something happened around about 1,000 years ago. A really big change happened. But before I talk about that first change, I will talk about something else, which was sweetness. Now, sugar didn't exist in the UK. The only form of sweetness at that time was honey. And if you were better off than the average serf, then the only time you would get to have honey would be when you got married. And we have this expression that you get married, there's a ceremony in the church, and you go on your honeymoon. Well, a lot of people don't know what the honeymoon is. I'm going to explain. The honeymoon actually relates to the drink that people would have at that time, and it's called mead. So mead is fermented honey. Honey has water and yeast added to it. It's fermented and makes this drink called mead. And the thing is, the mead has another name. It's called the honeymoon drink. So the one time in your life when you would actually have exposure to something sweet would be this drink called mead. You'd have it on your honeymoon. So that's the most exciting thing that would happen to a person. It was the only stimulant they actually had in their entire lives, was them. So then things changed. Around about 1,000 years ago, we got exposed to the very first really big stimulant, and it comes from the Arab world, and it's called sugar. And this was an incredible shock to the people. And the first experience that your average people had in the UK is as follows. They went on what were called Crusades, and this is really hard to understand, but basically the UK was a Christian country, and we had kings, Christian kings, and the Arab countries, they had the Muslim religion. So this thing about Christian and Muslim, it goes back a really long time. So what happened is the king would take a whole bunch of his soldiers, or ordinary common people, and they would go to what was called the Holy Land, the Middle East, and they would have wars. And this is what happened. These wars were called the Crusades, and the Crusades put them in touch with all sorts of things that they'd never had any experience of before. And the really big one was sugar. So the very first time, you can imagine, they would have these wars and they would fight, and when the Crusaders, the Christians, when they won these wars, they obviously got to take everything that they'd, they're the winners, they take everything, don't they? They rape, they pillage, do all these things, and they got their hands on sugar for the first time in their existence, in their ancestry. Wow, sugar. When they took sugar for the first time, it was like people in the 1960s taking a psychedelic drug like LSD. It had such a massive impact on their consciousness, and they had their first taste of a real stimulant, and they hallucinated, to use that funny old-fashioned expression. They literally saw everything differently, entered parallel realities, and had a totally different experience of being a human being. It was extraordinary when that happened to them. And there are wonderful apocryphal tales where the Crusaders had sugar and it totally affected them. So I'm now going to fast forward quite a bit to the next really big change that happened, because more and more trade started to happen with other cultures. The other thing that happened with the advent of spices, things like chili, things like pepper, this is a massive, huge change in people's lives, because when they started to eat food and they actually were able to afford minuscule amounts of pepper, that really changed things. This is like a stimulant, an intoxicant, and it caused people to have a different perception of life. They literally got stimulated into being able to perceive other things. But the really big one I want to talk to you about is with the introduction of tea and coffee, because this was a really big thing. And tea and coffee came from the East, obviously from places like India and China, and it was trade. So when sufficient amount of trade happened in England, in the UK, tea and coffee started to happen. It was amazing. So the first thing that happened is they created tea houses and coffee houses. These were places that people would go and drink this incredible beverage. Tea and coffee, for people at that time, was a most amazing stimulant, and it actually changed the entire course of history in the UK, because what happened is we had something called the Renaissance and also something called the Age of Enlightenment. So people would go and drink these drinks and they would have conversation because they were so stimulated, and they started to look at life and the world in a completely different way. And this was what brought about all the revolutions that happened in Western Europe. But I'm focusing on the UK. So it was a massive change that people have, and they started to think about things. They started to consider their lives, and so they started to actually be able to want things, to be able to want a different life, to want to live in a different way. So this is what it was. This is the cause of all the changes that happened in the UK, was stimulants. It was amazing how it affected people. Literally the desire for a different way of life. So this is 400 or 500 years ago this happened. And then there was another stimulant that came in, and this came from a different part of the world, because tea and coffee came from the Far East, but the other stimulant came from the West. And this only really happened when the countries in Western Europe started to sail their ships over to what they call the New World, what we call the Americas. So when people started to go to the New World and they started to trade with the indigenous peoples, it was an extraordinary thing that happened. Because one of the things that was brought back was tobacco. There were some other extraordinary things that were brought back. One of them was the potato, and another one was the tomato. The potato and the tomato came from South and Central America, and tobacco came mostly from North America. These foods made a huge difference in terms of the consciousness of the people. The thing about the grains that people eat, things like these grasses, because wheat and barley is just a development from the grasses, you had to put a huge amount of effort to grow these seeds, and you had to grind the grains down, and that gave you your carbohydrates, gave you the energy to actually be able to function. When the potato came along, it's extraordinary when you think about it, because these things are so much larger. I mean, they were tiny by our modern standards. Potatoes used to be really small, about that size at their biggest, and you used to boil them, cook them, and eat them. So suddenly you could get the carbohydrates into your body for so much less work. This had a massive impact on our lifestyle. But I want to focus more on tobacco. The tobacco is another really strong stimulant plant. People start to consume tobacco through smoking. This has a really big change in their consciousness and the way they looked at life. So what we've got going on in these years, from 1,000 years ago up to 500, 400 years ago, was very, very slowly the introduction of plants, mostly foods, also drinks, and also the idea that you could take a plant and smoke it. These were giving us a completely different perception of reality, and we got to perceive alternate realities, and we got to experience the idea of wanting, of desiring something else for ourselves. And this is when all the really big movements for revolutions took place. They were all completely orchestrated by the changes in what we were consuming. Let's go back to tea and coffee in the coffee houses. They were amazing things, these places, and of course tobacco was smoked in them as well when tobacco became commonly available for people to consume. So all this caused conversation, and that is still well known, that people go and have a cup of coffee and they feel like they want to chat more. It's a common thing even today, but it was such a big thing for people's awareness about what was possible. Inventions, all the things we take for granted, discoveries, this was all at the same time. The desire to go out and reach out into other countries. And what the UK did, the UK was a pretty dodgy bunch actually, because what the UK did, people in the UK, is they went off and they created an empire. And this is something to really grasp hold of. The British people, hundreds and hundreds of years ago, they were much smaller, they were much shorter people, and they were infinitely more aggressive. They'd been fighting amongst themselves for many, many centuries. But when these particular stimulants came in, it was the idea of, we want to go out, because literally their horizons were broadened and increased. And the main thing they did is they went out in the ships with a whole bunch of weapons, and they just attacked all the people that they encountered. And they were incredibly successful and efficient at doing this, and they created, over a period of hundreds of years, they created an empire. And pretty much they did the same thing wherever they went. They fought wars, they attacked the people, they subjugated the people, and they forced the people to consume the things that they want to trade. So I'm going to a little different period. I'm not speaking chronologically, but the most famous one was the Opium Wars at the beginning of the 19th century. And a lot of people don't know this, but yeah, what the British did, they literally went to China and they said to the Chinese, you're going to consume our opium, and if you don't, we're going to make war with you. And that's what happened. So the Chinese became addicted to opium because the British forced them into it. Crazy, crazy stuff when you look at his history. So what I want to do is I want to fast forward to a completely different period of time and show how things have changed, because I want it to take us to the 20th century, and particularly World War I and World War II. These are fascinating times because we created this whole empire. We'd literally gone to all these different parts of the world. We'd fought wars, we'd subjugated people, we'd forced them to live the way we wanted to, the way we thought was right. And there are certain things that came about through that. For example, transport, things like railways, that all happened in the 18th, 19th century. It was an amazing time. Yeah, we did literally force all these methods of communication and transport onto the people. Yeah. But we did some really horrific things, no question about it. And you can go into more detail and find out the things we did. Really terrible. But what I want to do is now focus on the 20th century and see how things have actually come forward. Well, the really big change that happened over these centuries is that rather than these stimulants being available for the few and then available for the many in really small amounts, these stimulants started to become available in vast, huge quantities. So sugar, for example, it changed from being something that the Crusaders had a small experience of and it literally knocked their socks off, through to the point where what actually happened is we really got into slavery big time. This is obviously a really big part of the ugly part of the UK story. We weren't the only country in the world to do it, but we were a really big one. We were incredibly effective at doing this, enslaving huge numbers of people, and we got them to grow sugar cane, for example. And we literally took people from Africa, took them to different parts of the world, forced them to grow sugarcane. So we then had a vast increase in the amount of sugar that was available, and it became available for everyone. Common people, everyone was consuming sugar in vast amounts. And then likewise the tea and coffee plantations, slavery, the same thing. So we were consuming these stimulants, but in larger and larger amounts, and everyone across the board, everyone's having these things. It became normal. So by the time it came to World War I and World War II, you got this situation where people are going to war and they're killing and they're fighting and millions are dying. within a short number of years. That's an extraordinary thing. Now, the only way that the people were able to cope with that degree of utter horror, just imagine World War One. People are in trenches, in holes in the ground. Imagine there's a hole in the ground that goes on for many miles, and they're in these holes in the ground. They spend years in there, literally, and they're just slobbering around in the mud, and every now and again they get told by the officers to get up and go and take their weapons and go and charge the enemy. And of course the enemy is sitting in their trenches, got their machine guns, and they're just killing them all. And both sides do this. It's a completely bizarre experience. That's what World War One was like. Now, it was so horrific that the only way these people could cope was to be given stimulants, so they were stimulated up to their eyeballs. Tobacco, tea, sugar. That's what people needed to be able to actually do this. World War One, World War Two. Then the other thing that's happening is such huge numbers of people were being exterminated, being killed in that time, that what you've got from the shamanic perspective, is interesting. When people die, huge numbers, they died in such vast numbers that when that soul disconnected from the body, all these people being killed, that then meant that you've got these disembodied spirits which are hanging around. They've been killed abruptly and suddenly, and this is where the whole story of the ghosts came from. The hauntings and negative energies, demons, spirits, negative spirits, all this stuff, this is where it all comes from. So of course what they needed to do is they needed to consume things to help them actually live in that nightmare of hell, which was everyone's experience at that time. And so tobacco became an incredibly important plant that people needed to consume. And in fact, if you go to the early part of the 20th century, pretty much everyone was smoking. Children were smoking, pretty much everyone was smoking. They needed to do that to be able to survive the horror that they were going through in those times. It was a very strange time indeed. So if we look at how it's actually affected people, this is where I want to bring us to. So I'm now going to do a big overview. The overview is as follows. 1,000 years ago, everyone was a low-grade alcoholic, and everyone was really depressed, and their worldview was very narrow, all they could conceive of. And I need to explain a bit more detail about the Feudal Society. When you were a serf, you were the property of your lord. When your lord wanted you to fight a war, you would just become a soldier and you'd go fight a war, and you'd abandon your wife and children and your holdings, your home, and you just go and fight. And you might die, you might not, might get seriously wounded, injured. What? That's just how it was. You had no choice. The other thing is, you lived in your lord's land. It's called the demesne, and that's where you lived. You were not allowed to go anywhere else. You were not allowed to go maybe 1 or 2 miles away to the nearest village. No, your entire life was spent living in your lord's demesne, his holding. And occasionally people would attempt to escape, and they'd be hunted down and treated very badly, if not killed. So that's what it was like 1,000 years ago. So people had such a narrow view of existence. Over this 1,000 years, more and more stimulants have come into people's existence, making more and more stimulants, and they're having a larger and larger perception of existence, and they're part of an empire which is going around enslaving other races, exterminating people, fighting wars, forcing our entire cultural values onto the way people lived. This is all going on. But by the time you got to the 20th century, this influx of stimulants was getting to the point that we were reaching a tipping point. And the tipping point is as follows. And by the time it got to World War II, it's really starting to happen. The amount of stimulants people were consuming was so huge, it was taking to this point. And the point is, when you consume so much stimulant, eventually you reach the point where things start to collapse in, and we get all the chronic degenerative diseases starting to really increase. Now, if you look online, you'll discover the number one cause of death through illness in America is heart disease. Yeah, particular form of heart disease. Heart disease and cancer, primary causes, dietary speaking, refined sugar, refined carbohydrates, and the stimulants. Yeah, these are all the causes. These are all the primary causes of these severe illnesses that are killing more people than just about anything else. Really big thing to take on. So the point we've reached is we're also overstimulated that it creates the opposite effect. It creates the downer, the oh my goodness me, the loss of energy. And so we're at this incredibly exciting point in human history, and I'm looking at the UK because most people are chronically dependent upon the stimulants just to live. What I mean to say is I'd be hard pushed to think of anyone that I know that doesn't consume sugar in large amounts, or tea, or coffee, or tobacco. And then of course in more recent times you've got the pharmaceutical drugs, which is also another form of stimulant, and we've got the street drugs, the MDMA, the cocaine, the rest of it. So what I'm saying is, if you are a person and you're living in the UK and you're not consuming any stimulants whatsoever, you are such a rarity. So one of the really big payoffs that we're having for this 1,000-year journey with the stimulants is what I would call debauch. And it's time for me to stop.